me drinking my coffee.
All right. We are live.
Oh, it's very exciting. This is the pre-show chit chat. If anybody's watching.
Exactly. I'm just saying hello to everyone who's viewing. In 5 minutes.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're seeing the comments, right?
I have yet to. I see a general comment, but not a new one.
I have placed comments. We already have a like. Oh, we have
from Prague.
We have Prague in the house.
Prague is in the house.
Neighbor.
Oh, I see it. Yeah. Central Europe is getting a real winter this year.
Is it sunny? I hope it's sunny in Prague like it is here.
I wonder.
I'm usually there this time of year. It was last January.
Yeah. I'm asking Prague if it's sunny, and Emna Sayadi says, "Go Jillian."
Great.
Jill's frozen.
Yeah. It's not me.
Minus 19 with no sun in Prague. Jill is frozen. Briefly. Jillian, you may need to rejoin.
That's interesting. There you are.
Okay. Jill will join us again. We have Ivan. There you are. On the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, Jill is back.
Browsers, hopefully that'll fix it.
Yeah.
Yep. There we go.
Oh, no sun in Prague. Disappointing. This is all natural light from the sun here.
Great. And then
hopefully it'll stay.
Is it snowing as well? Because when the snow, you have even more light because the light is bouncing off the snow.
Yeah, it snowed the past 2 days. Today it's nice and clear, but I'm sure we can expect more throughout the week.
How does this compare to last year's winter? Was there snow? Was it like a
I don't remember snow. I don't remember any last year.
I don't remember anything about last year. So yeah.
I don't have any memory anymore.
I know last year is it's a black hole. It really is.
It is. I remember. Well, so I do remember snow in Prague last January, and I remember being in Denmark. That was my last trip before the pandemic, the end of February, and there were already flowers coming up out of the ground. So that contrast is a little strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, my last trip was to Kathmandu in February, and for a conference. And I remember I flew home. I got really sick on the flight home. I hit Qatar and I got really sick. And then I spent the next month in quarantine.
Oh no! Do you know if you had it?
I don't know because I wasn't able to get tested, but I had a whole bunch of symptoms that turned into bronchitis. But that didn't match the prescribed symptoms at the time.
At the time, yeah, exactly.
So I was sick for a couple months. It was not much fun.
And I had all the symptoms in January 2020, and I wasn't near anyone else because I was so sick that I canceled all my travel. My partner was away, so I think I did have it. It's the only thing that explains how I haven't gotten it since. I think.
Well, although you've been masking and all that, you haven't been misbehaving.
No, but everyone around me has.
Okay. Yeah, no, I know quite a few people who have had it. All right, we have the people entering the room. Great.
Excellent.
Number on YouTube. Number on Facebook.
Georgia, you're going to stay on the. You'll be in the background if we. We'll be able to hear. We'll be able to hear you if you. We need.
I'll keep my mic open. Yes.
Yeah. So, that's.
Yeah, so I can say things.
Okay.
I'll be the invisible person in the background. All right, 1 minute to
1 minute till
live.
go time.
Yeah.
Mm.
Run our ticker tape.
Oh, look at that. Oh. You're having so much fun with this program,
Yeah.
Georgia. This is like bringing out your inner production geek. I can tell.
Totally.
I love it.
Totally. And I've never really done live, so. Hey, Suzanne, Lane. Hello from snowy Strasbourg.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi,
Yes,
Suzanne.
Okay.
I got the tweets. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, and we're gonna go live in a couple of seconds. All right. Speakers, stand by.
All right.
We're gonna run our trailer and we're gonna go live.
Great. Wow, that's the Death Star music. Jillian.
Perfect.
Yes. Hi, Jillian. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Nice to see you. I'm sorry we're not cats for everyone who's
I
commenting
know.
about that.
I
No
know.
cat filter on StreamYard.
I wish we had cats on our heads, sitting on our heads. That would be great.
I've got a dog behind me.
You do. Several. It's good. So welcome, everybody. This is the next episode of Global Voices Insights. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Global Voices is an international network of writers, activists, translators, and we used to call ourselves bloggers, but since blogging died way back in 2014, we really we don't use that terminology anymore. And Jillian will tell us all about that.
Hey, I still blog.
I do too, but I don't tell anybody anymore.
Yeah. We don't talk about it.
We don't talk about it. It's in the closet. Folks are watching today on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch, and we look forward to hearing from you as well in the comments section. Today we're going to talk for a while, and then we'll invite some questions, and then we'll talk some more, and then we'll invite some more questions, and hopefully we'll have a lively hour. Jillian has spent the last 4 years deep in book writing mode, and we're very excited to talk about the result. It's a good day. It's a good week. You can pose questions to Jillian directly from the platform that you're on, and we'll be able to see it. And for those of you who are watching later, welcome. So, Jillian, Silicon Values.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for writing this book.
You're welcome.
It's filled a huge hole in my literature needs. It's a concise and carefully argued explanation of the many ways the social media platforms are failing to manage the marginal and edge cases in the world. And it's I'm especially struck in your writing by the kind of the humility with which you approach your subject. And I think it's remarkable because after, as you say, 10 years working on content moderation, 15 years working on freedom of expression, and you're incredibly knowledgeable about this topic. And yet so many of the issues that you're approaching, you want us to, you keep reminding us again and again that these are really complex issues and not easily solved, and that approaching solutions with humility is really important. And the tone of your writing is that as well. And I enjoyed your voice throughout, in addition to the many ideas and anecdotes that you have. So again, thank you for writing this. And I wonder if we can start by asking you to give us a quick description of what it is that you've done.
Sure.
With Silicon Values.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I appreciate the compliment so much because, when I first got into this field through Global Voices and slightly before through the blogging community, I felt really sure of my answers. And over the years, I've become less and less sure of what the right solutions are because of the complexity of it. So just to give kind of the overview of the book, this book covers a number of different topics, some deeper, some less so. But the real themes around it are, of course, the ways in which social media platforms were and continue to be used for activism. It looks specifically, the first few chapters look at the Arab uprisings of 2010 through 11, but kind of beyond as well, and into the inflection point of what I would see as, kind of what happened between 2014 and 2016 with the rise of the Islamic State, but also the rise of right-wing extremism in the United States, Brazil, and elsewhere. And then I also, just kind of veer off for a few chapters and talk about one of my pet topics, which is the censorship of sex, sexuality, nudity, and sexual expression, which is something that I think these platforms have really just truly gotten wrong over the years, and that I feel very strongly about. And then, of course, the last few topics are also just kind of plucked in there, but I look at hate speech over the past few years. I look at the rise of automation. I wrote most of this book before the pandemic, but luckily was given an extra few months to kind of cover what automation has meant during this time where we're all at home. And then, of course, I leave you with a pretty open conclusion of the answers aren't going to come from me. They need to come from global voices to not get too punny.
Indeed. Yeah, and you were present as a witness and as a participant in those early years in the Arab uprisings, and a lot of both the excitement, but also the trepidation that many people felt around the use of technologies for activism. And we have the mass media narrative that used to valorize or speak with almost kind of simple excitement, almost like a deterministic thinking around the effects of social media and conflict. And I think, and in protest and activism and political change. And I think you do a pretty good job of demolishing that narrative, because that we start in that narrative, social media was good and now it's awful. And neither of those things are really true, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, they never really were, right? And I remember one of my very first encounters, my first encounter in real life, maybe my second, with this community was in 2008 when we had the Global Voices Summit. Not the first one, but the first really big one, I think, in Budapest. And that was the first time I met you. It was the first time I met Sami Penrabia, Ala Abdel Fattah, like a lot of the key players that in both the Global Voices community, but also in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Syria, etc. And so I feel really fortunate to have been I remember this one specific meeting during that. I think it was around the launch of the Berkman Klein Center's Arab Bloggers Report, which I was critical of. And so were a lot of the people in the room, but yet it was still what brought those people together in that room. Yeah. And I remember listening to those voices and thinking, okay, like this isn't as simple as Hillary Clinton's State Department is portraying it. It's not as simple as the media portrayed it around the 2009 Iran uprising. And this is going to take a lot to unpack. And I think, we're still unpacking it 10, 11, 12, 13 years ago or from later. Those days. Yeah, later. Lost all my language during the pandemic. Sorry, I used to be good at this.
Yes, fluency.
Yeah. English,
not necessary.
Nah.
So when I think about your takeaway, so one of the things that's really changed in the last decade is that social media companies have really created a system that's impossible to moderate, that all of its solutions are stopgap and reactive, and they punish those without power or those who are marginal to the platform's financial interests. And when I think about like all of the takeaways in Silicon Valley, you keep coming back to this point that much of the conversation that we have about what's right and what's wrong about social media platforms, and I want to say social media platforms, not the internet in general, because that conversation is itself somewhat marginal. But the platforms themselves have become again and again, a system that is too large, too unwieldy to actually serve the interests of citizens, of people, not necessarily just of users. And yet all of the responses that we see seem to be reactive or too late, too slow, too little.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do always like to emphasize that it does really depend on the platform, and I see them as all very, very different, even though they often get lumped together. As you know from the book, I focus a lot on Facebook because it's the biggest, but also because I find it to be the most problematic. And so I'm going to use it as an example here to say that what I see Facebook doing is having built these policies. And Mark Zuckerberg is, I think, 2 years younger than me. So he built these policies at Harvard when he was in his early 20s. And some of those policies that he put in from the beginning, when Facebook was intended to be a site for college students just at one university, are still in place today. And what that means to me is that, we've let this young man put in place his version of values, social values around speech, around privacy. And those have become so entrenched that even, how many years are we out now? 13, 14 years out from the early days of Facebook, we still have not just those original rules, but then all of these new layers built on top of them. There's never been a full audit. There's never been a look back or a look forward to say, hey, it's 2021 now. Is this still the right way to be doing things? And instead, it feels like this group of people have just isolated and marginalized themselves into this little bubble. And to be clear, again, all of these companies are worthy of criticism, but Facebook in particular, their bubble is a very, very homogenous bubble. Not everyone is white, but almost everyone's American. Almost everyone is cisgender, Ivy League educated, and it seems like that bubble at the top just keeps getting smaller. And so when we look at the way that the rules are changing, there's often some vague consultations here or there, and I'm sure that Global Voices folks have been part of those, but it feels like they're often just lip service, and that there's not real change coming from this alleged consultatory process.
And as I think you point out in the book a couple of times, there are plenty of people inside those companies who are thoughtful and considerate of these issues, but they aren't the ones with the power to actually change the policies at a wholesale level, right? Is that right?
Not at Facebook. Yeah, that's right. Definitely not at Facebook. So Facebook, I'm going to talk about Facebook and Twitter a little bit here because they're quite different. At Facebook, you've got that top bubble of people. At the bottom, you've got content moderators who are often not well paid, often employed by third-party companies and based all around the world, but in particular in the Philippines and other parts of the global south. And in the middle there, between those folks and the policy teams, you have what they kind of call community operations managers. And those folks are usually in Dublin. Now, they're some of the most educated, worldly, well-traveled, multilingual people. And they're often in the right rooms, but they don't have the power to make the changes. And I talked to a few of those people for my book. What makes Twitter different is a couple things. One is that they don't really have that layer of third-party content moderators, and they might have some, but a lot of that work is done in-house. And they have a more diverse and thoughtful and really agile team making the rules and responding to them. And I think that's why we've seen them kind of change rapidly over the past few months and years and really get quite a few things right. I mean, I still think they make a lot of mistakes, but if you look at the way that they handled Trump and the way they talked about it, it was a lot more thoughtful, a lot more intuitive, and a lot more deliberative in its methods.
But your underlying point is that those mistakes are inevitable, right?
Yeah.
Because of the structural underpinnings of the system.
Yeah, and I think that when we put this to a centralized committee in any way, I mean, there's a reason that the U.S. has free speech traditions as it does. You can criticize them, and a lot of people would say that, the U.S. should be more attuned to the UN system. But even the UN version of human rights allows most speech. There are very, very limited exceptions, and they must pass rigid tests. And so, whether we want the US version or we want the UN version, that reasonable minds can disagree. But there's a reason that we created these systems as we did, rather than centralized committees that make up the rules as they go, based often on nothing really. And so I do think that this is ultimately a flawed system, that if you're going to leave it to these layers of people, these, very human, or again, we'll come back to automation, I'm sure, but these automated systems that can't detect nuance, that can't really do anything beyond binary, then you're never going to have a system of speech moderation or expression moderation that is fair, and that is applied in a not just evenly and consistently, but also in a way that takes into account power structures.
So we have with us today on the call people from Italy, Ireland, France, the Czech Republic, Uganda, Bangladesh, the Philippines, all over the world, and more coming. So, which I think is a nice tie-in to what you just said, because, like, how is it that a U.S. set of values that's applied in such a wide range of countries is ever going to function, and what do we do about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not going to profess to have the answers, but when I think about this question, there are a couple things that come to mind. The first is, I'm definitely an internationalist. I think a lot of folks here are. And so I don't like to think that people in, India are less capable of nonviolence than people in the United States. But these companies definitely see it that way, right? So they've moderated much more strictly in certain countries than they have in the US, because there's this idea that somehow Americans are above all that. I don't know who this comes from or why it exists, but we've seen it in the way that the rules are applied. And we saw great exceptions being given to the US, even at the same time where mistakes were being made there in content moderation. And then, one of the key examples that I always come back to that's heavily emphasized in the book is this thing that happened in 2012 that I think a lot of people will remember. This video called "The Innocence of Muslims" that came from a Coptic Egyptian living in the United States, but at first nobody really knew where it came from. And it had been played on Egyptian television and then put out on YouTube. And the State Department tried to intervene with YouTube and say, hey, take this video down. So that you had the US government saying, take this video down because it's going to make these people in these other countries get violent. And it was really interesting to see the way that YouTube responded, because what they actually did was, instead of taking it down wholesale, they took it down just for Egypt and Libya, sorry. And so the underlying assumption there is, can't trust those Egyptians and Libyans to not get violent, but everybody else will be okay. And the trickle-down effect was that a bunch of governments were like, hey, what about us? And started demanding that the video come down. And so, again, it was taken down in those countries, but it was left up in the US, again, because of this assumption that Americans are somehow different. And I think that American exceptionalism it comes out through a bunch of their processes, but that example still lives in my mind as one of the most salient.
Yeah, and that points really clearly to the fact that there's not a universally applied or universally consistent set of rules for users of different platforms.
Right. And I think that, these companies were given the right to curate as they see fit. And I do believe in that right. But again, I think that it needs to be applied consistently, both in terms of across different countries. And I know other people disagree with that. There are a lot of people who feel that the rules should differ by country. I think that they should be universalist, but they should be agreed upon through some kind of direct democratic process, and then applied evenly both to me and you and folks from all these different countries, but also to powerful figures such as President Trump or the presidents or leaders of other countries as well.
I think we'll get into this really interesting and complicated question around whether or not political actors or political speech should have a different category in a little while. We do have a first question, which is, how do you compare platforms in other countries like Vkontakte and WeChat? And do you think US-based social media platforms can learn and improve from alternative and similar platforms?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. I'm not as familiar with Vkontakte, so I have to leave that one out because I try not to answer things that I'm going to say something completely wrong about. But WeChat I find troubling in the same way that I find Facebook. The rules are obviously much stricter, and the response mechanism is quite different to what gets removed and how and why. And yet it is still a very centralized censorship system that, you know, seeks to, in the kind of Chinese model, harmonize the speech that happens on the platform. But to me, it's not all that different from Facebook. And so, you know, I think that they actually kind of have learned from the Chinese system in a lot of ways by making these rules and applying them in a way that ensures I mean, I hate the term harmonization, and I hate the way that it's used in this context, and yet it's still kind of true, because I think that Facebook is trying to make everyone happy in a very similar way to WeChat.
But it's fascinating because the motives are different. You know, WeChat's doing it because of a set of dictates coming from the government, a set of very clear rules that are handed down from the ministries, and Facebook is responding to market signals. And government, but dispersed governments, and they're not mandated, right? For the most part, they're not mandated.
Yeah.
Mostly, it's more like a nudge. It's more like you do this, we'll do that. It's like, I think you talk about this, that there's an unspoken or backroom channel that's occurring rather than any kind of transparent process. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's a few things that are forced, but for the most part, it is a nudge. And yet it is this nudge where, you know, you'll have certain coalitions of governments that are kind of pushing companies to do certain things. So France and Germany are often on the same page, and they wield a lot of power over these platforms, and they threaten them. I've got folks in the book telling me straight up that France loves to threaten the companies. What the threat exactly is, I'm not sure. But, you know, in the old days, the threat was often, we'll block you. And Turkey still makes that threat. I feel like India is probably about to make that threat to Twitter if they haven't already. And so that threat is ever present, whether it's we're going to block you or we're going to regulate you. But nevertheless, I think that certain powerful countries, and not just powerful in the kind of geopolitical sense, but in the market sense. So Turkey's a huge e-commerce market. Germany and France are obviously huge. The US and India, you know, more users than many countries. I think you could also say the same for Saudi Arabia and YouTube. It's still, I think, the biggest user of YouTube. And so they do, in a lot of ways, have to care about what Saudi thinks.
Fascinating. And so here's a question for you. Within different kinds of large language sphere, like Arabic, we have the fact that Saudi is the primary is one of the largest users. Saudi values are actually trickling down to other more liberal, more open Arabic language communities. Can you explain a little bit about how that works?
Sure. So
I know you talked about some in the book. It's a fascinating section.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. I mean, I love it and I hate it. So yeah, about 10, 11 years ago, I wrote this paper at the Berkman Center with Helmi Noman, who's a researcher. I forget where he's based now, but back then he was based in the Gulf. And what we learned was that Microsoft Bing was applying its safe search to the entire Arabic-speaking region, even though a lot of those countries weren't censoring the internet in any meaningful way. And it took me years to figure out what happened. But finally, in 2015, a Microsoft employee admitted to me that the reason was not because the government had demanded it, but because of market research. And so I finally, I had to do a lot of digging for my book. And what I learned was that these companies employ market research firms that have their bases in Saudi or the UAE or sometimes Bahrain, Kuwait. And so they're making decisions based on what those markets want, as opposed to, say, what the Lebanese or Tunisian market wants. And to give a more recent example of that, Twitter has this really strange policy where it bans alcohol advertisements in a number of countries, which includes Russia, which really surprised me, but I'm not as familiar with the laws there on alcohol ads. But it also includes Lebanon. And I was like, why would Lebanon be banned from alcohol advertising? I mean, anyone who's been to Beirut can tell that alcohol ads are everywhere. And again, it turns out that it was a market research decision, not having nothing to do with what Lebanese people or the Lebanese government wants, but having to do with the fact that there's an assumption that the region is non-drinking. And of course, much of it is.
In the Russia case, I actually know the answer to that. Russia has periodically banned, I used to live in Russia, so as you know, so Russia has periodically banned or attempted to restrict access to alcohol, in part because it is so popular. Alcohol, Russia has a very, very serious problem with alcoholism. Yeah. And in the 1980s, Russia, there were actually, bans on vodka sales, and people made home brew and all sorts of things like that. And those kinds of waves of governmental attempts to control happen periodically. And so that's what it's tied to.
All right.
Yeah.
Mystery solved.
Yeah, indeed. So we have a couple other questions.
Sure.
And this one is it safe for serious, sensitive, and secret issues being shared through the internet? If not, what are the best channels for those who share those kinds of information? That kind of information, like security type issues.
That's such a great question. So, I mean, when I think about security, I there's no one tool, there's no silver bullet, and there never has been. There probably never will be. When we're talking about sharing things across the internet, a lot of times we're talking about sharing them across borders or across towns, or these days even from here to down the street because I can't meet my friend. And so, you know, you have to think about a lot of different things, but you're looking at, what am I trying to protect? Who am I trying to protect it from? What's the likelihood that somebody's going to come after me? And those types of questions really differ from individual to individual. So that's one part of it. The other part is that you're only as safe as the people or person or people that you're communicating with. So you could do everything right. You could use all the right tools and, you know, apply all the heaviest encryption. But if your friend has their phone unlocked, then everything that you've said is going to be exposed to whatever threat, you know, whatever individual or government or what have you is looking at it. So I would say it's not safe, but there are things you can do to be safer. There's some great resources out there. I'll point to EFF's, which is Surveillance Self-Defense. We also link out to a number of other ones. There's an app called Umbrella. There's a lot of wonderful tools to look at to help you find some of the best channels. And I hate to go for one tool, but I think right now Signal is kind of best of show. Telegram is also popularly used, but you want to make sure that you're turning on the secret chat model. Otherwise, you're not really encrypted. But yeah, there are a number of ways you can be safer, just no guarantee that you're going to be safe.
That's great. Thanks, Jillian. I want to bring us back to the book, and I want to give you an opportunity to give us a sense of the flavor of it. So I know you have a passage prepared to read, and I wonder if you could give us a taste of the prose.
Sure. So this is from the second chapter? Second chapter of the book, called Offline Repression is Replicated Online, which is actually a phrase that some of my colleagues came up with a few years ago, and which really stands true to me. So I'll just dive right in. If anyone has questions about the context, I'm happy to go there. From the beginning, many governments saw social media as a threat. It didn't just allow their country's citizens to stay in touch with friends and family. It enabled them to mobilize, to find like-minded others, and scheme with them, often behind the curtain of private groups. It emboldened people to do things under the cover of relative anonymity that they might not otherwise, like criticize the government. As such, a number of countries decided early on to block social media platforms. Thailand was among the first, blocking YouTube in 2006. Syria's government followed, blocking Facebook in 2007, ostensibly to prevent youth from having contact with Israelis, but more likely because it would help foster civil society. Over the next few years, these countries were joined by Turkey, Tunisia, Pakistan, and Iran in enacting wholesale or partial bans. For executives at these companies, this spelled disaster. Countries like Turkey represented massive emerging markets, and the prevailing wisdom at the time was that once a site was blocked, it was rarely restored. At the same time, governments could block individual YouTube videos or Facebook pages, but more often than not, they went for the whole platform instead. For both corporate executives and certain governments, it was time for a new strategy. The internet may not be borderless, as early theorists suggested, but its borders have never matched up perfectly with those of nation states. A website that tries to prevent, say, Germans from viewing its content will find that a few slip through the cracks. For example, 2 French groups had sued Yahoo in 2000 to remove Nazi uniforms and memorabilia from its popular auction site on the grounds that users in France, where such sales are illegal, could access the platform. I'm just going to skip really quickly to end this out. So after all of that happened, enter geolocation technology, which enabled big players like music and film studios to replace technical restrictions on digital content. The resultant effect is music files that disappear when one crosses a border, or Netflix content that differs from one country to the next. Over time, these improved technologies made geolocation much easier, allowing platforms to customize news sites and search and video hosting sites to comply with existing copyright and licensing requirements. Eventually, social media platforms began utilizing these technologies, first to geographically segment copyrighted material from foreign markets, and later to narrow compliance with government orders. And then I go into some examples. But the reason that I chose that particular passage is that I think that that's what we're about to see or are seeing with India. We're seeing protests happen in India where Twitter is closing the book. Twitter is refusing to comply with some of these requests, saying, these are not democratic. These are not in line with international norms. And I talked to an Indian journalist this morning who was asking me, and I was like, I think you know the answer better than I do, but he was asking me whether I thought India would move to block Twitter. And I said, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what would happen now if they did with all of these millions or billions of users. And I think that we're really back at this kind of similar precipice to where we were in 2011, 2012, of what's going to happen next and how the companies will react.
And of course, right next door, well, India, the first internet block that I'm aware of was Kargil in the Kargil War in 1999, where India shut down the internet for months at a time during that war, and and periodically shut it in Kashmir starting from the early 2000s. But so India is like the godfather of internet blocking.
You just proved that I got something in my book wrong. That's why I was like, no, I thought that the first block was Mauritius.
Well, I mean, I suspect there's probably earlier ones, but when the Indians were doing it, in those years, there wasn't really a field of study. Like people knew about it if they were working on those topics, but there wasn't this kind of notion that different types of filtering or blocking was coming on as a practice, and there wasn't the analytic framing to know and to compare to other types of blocking didn't exist at that time, right? The field of study didn't exist.
No, and then I get in on the ground floor with that field of study in 2007, right. About 2 or 3 years after the OpenNet initiative started doing their work. That was with Berkman and the Citizen Lab in Toronto and a couple other institutions. But that's thanks to Global Voices and Ethan and Solana, I got to work on that. Yeah.
And of course, this week in Myanmar, the same thing is happening, right? With more blocks.
Everything old is new again.
Everything old is new again. But now with this kind of increasingly granular capacity, and of course, if we're seeing this kind of granularity now, the question is, where is it leading? Like I always hesitate to ask anybody to predict anything when it comes to the internet, but you probably have a sense of the direction of the technology, at least, and as well as the policy, and this kind of increasingly kind of careful segmentation of the market based on different speech modes. Is that where we're going? That different segments, different communities, different national regulatory environments will actually have different rules?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And we're already seeing that. I mean, we're seeing it with Germany and the NetzDG, or Network Enforcement Act law, which requires companies to take down certain types of illegal speech within 24 hours. It's not working out so well so far. But at the same time, Twitter looks very different from here than it does from the US, because a lot of the Nazi content's just not available. So, you switch your VPN on and suddenly there's a bunch of different accounts that you couldn't see 5 minutes before. So we are already seeing that. And I think we're going to see a lot more regulation coming from the US, coming from the European Union, but also coming from large democracies or quasi-democracies, India, Brazil, Turkey, etc. Turkey actually has also already implemented a law that it's like the German Network Enforcement Act, but like much, much worse.
For those of us who dream of a borderless world and who still hope for an open zone of internet kind of communications of the open internet, simply, Tanya Lockhart has a great question. So she asks, is there a theoretical set of universal values for the internet that could come to replace industry-specific capitalist or national values? How would that work governance-wise?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is I think we have to pull all the way back and stop viewing the internet as being in a vacuum. I think that a lot of the people and for good reason, I mean, we're always putting out fires in this community, in the digital rights community. And so for good reason, a lot of us have been viewing this as a game of whack-a-mole, or putting out fires and going, okay, how do we fix the internet? When really what we need to be fixing is society at large and our political systems. So we can't view the internet and free expression outside of capitalism, socialism, etc. Tanya's somebody who's I think of as smarter than me on a lot of this stuff. So I'm intimidated by even trying to answer this question. But yeah, I would say that, a set of universal values needs to come from the people. It needs to come from a democratic deliberative process that is inclusionary of not just, the Westerners who are, I hate that term, but Westerners who are currently making these decisions, and, inclusive of the people of governments that are not necessarily democratic. And again, I think I would like to see this extracted from the capitalist system. I don't want to see these platforms nationalized. I've heard that proposal a few times, and I can't even imagine as a US person what that would look like. But I do think that we could replace a lot of the structures that we have with governance structures that, they're not going to look like the Facebook oversight board, which is kind of a ad hoc and not so great version of this. But we could see some sort of accountability mechanism or process that has oversight committees to these platforms, either within or outside of preferably a capitalist structure. I hope that got even close to answering what is a really hard question.
I have a couple of specific follow-up questions for you.
Yeah.
So if we think of I think you make this point several times in the book that and it's one of your takeaways that the quote governance of content moderation isn't actually governance; it's governance theater.
Yeah,
right? It's because it's the rules can be changed anytime, and it's kind of a kabuki dance, and I also it has this kind of theatrical and sensational component to it in that it's tied to end goals that are not necessarily around convincing people that something has occurred, whether or not it actually has.
Yeah.
The alternative, of course, that many in our community have talked about for a long time is some kind of UN or international based rule set that isn't based in the United States. It's not, but at least it's a universal norm.
Yeah.
But of course, anytime we actually try to get the UN to implement something of this sort, it tends to not go very well. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how does one use international standards without going to the UN, or is there a path with some kind of international organization or international body that actually looks like true governance rather than governance theater?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd say why not create a new one? And I think that the prelude to this book is Rebecca McKinnon's 2012 book, which, obviously she's been a huge influence on my life and on my process of thinking here. And so going back to her idea of the Magna Carta for the internet and what that could look like, I think, we do have to update that. That was almost 10 years ago. And so a lot of things have changed since then. But I think that if we're looking at this as through a self-regulatory process, which right now is kind of the only real option that we have available given the UN system, I would say there are a few things that companies can do right this second. One of those is forward consent. So anytime the rules change, users have to re-accept them, ensuring that one thing that I think everybody can agree on, even if we think that the rules, even if we have different ideas about hate speech or things like that, is a system of transparency that does not exist, that these companies have been promising for years and never delivering upon. And a lot of this is written in the Santa Clara Principles on Transparency and Accountability for Content Moderation, which was a deliberative process and one that a lot of the companies endorsed but have not implemented. Reddit has, gotta love them. And they also include something that is super, super important and has backslid during the pandemic, which is remedy. This is in the Ruggie Principles, which are another set of UN principles. It's a core principle of the UN and international human rights framework. But if you put this into the systems that we have now, really what we're talking about is appeals. When decisions are made, they're often wrong or erroneous, mistakes, whatever you want to call them. But users often have no option to appeal. There's no customer service. And so even if we're sticking with the same frameworks we have for now, companies could apply this stuff today. Stop spending your money on acquisitions and massive engineering salaries and put it on these very basic concepts that civil society has been demanding for more than a decade at this point.
We have another question, which I will bring up, which is, do you consider psychological manipulation with the objective to increase conversion rates a crime? Whoa. Contrary to psychological manipulation via online media posts of political objectives.
I have a hard time answering this within the criminal framework. So I'm going to punt on that and say that I can't really say whether I consider it a crime, only because I haven't thought about it that way. What I can say is that I absolutely think that it's manipulation. I think that when it has a monetary or political objective, I think we do have to think of it in the same way that we think of propaganda. And I view the term propaganda outside of I know it's most often used to refer to governments, but I think that at this point, we can't just view state actors. Not only do we have, major non-state actors like the Islamic State or, drug cartels, et cetera, playing big roles in the manipulation processes that happen online. You've also got like paid bots that stand up for certain corporations. I was attacked by one today that clearly came from China and was probably paid. I don't know who paid them, but they were defending Signal to me in this really strange way. So I think that kind of psychological manipulation, whether or not it should be criminalized, I'm not sure. I tend to be an abolitionist, so it's hard for me to think of it that way. But I do think that it's not that different from the kind of traditional propaganda and psychological manipulation systems that exist.
I think you make a really another strong point that you make in the book is that when we think about censorship or restriction of any kind of speech, and we only focus on the restriction, the act of restriction, without focusing on the underlying core issues that cause that restriction to become a problem in the first place, we're missing a trick. And so I keep thinking about different tools and different techniques or different ways that the platforms could shape the spaces for expression to make a lot of the issues that we have irrelevant. Things like the ability for users to shape or control what kind of content they do or don't see, whether or not people are sharing their stories, whether or not people have the right to comment. And I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. So let me talk about Reddit for just a quick second, because I think that they're really fascinating as a platform. I assume that there's some Reddit users out there. I'm more of a lurker myself, but I think it's a really cool and interesting platform that has a lot of healthy dynamics in addition to some really toxic ones. But what makes it that way is that the users are often in control. So when you've got Reddit, the platform, but then you've got subreddits, which are topical fora. And so one of the ones that I like to participate on is one that's just a bunch of different Europeans talking about what's different about their countries. And it's super healthy. It's moderated by individuals who are heavy participants in the platform. And if that subreddit were to go really toxic, the centralized folks at Reddit might quarantine it, which would still allow it to continue, but it wouldn't allow new people to join. And that's what happened to the Donald subreddit. So that's like one. Oh, and the upvote, downvote system is also really important there, because the good comments float to the top and the ones that people dislike go to the bottom. And so that's just one example of like a really participatory framework that is a very different model from how Facebook exists, which is that sometimes the most toxic comments are monetized and viralized. So again, Reddit's not perfect. It does have its issues as well, but I think that we should be thinking about that way. And, I will say that I can't talk about what they are exactly, but I have been privy to some of the conversations happening inside the big companies these days. And some of them even some of the companies that I criticize the most are looking at new frameworks to make the communities that exist within them healthier. Is it too little, too late? Maybe, but they've got people working on these problems. And I do think that there is opportunity for that. And I think, we should see new platforms coming soon, I hope, not just Gabs and Parlors, but new platforms that, are the kind that we want to be on. And maybe those platforms do things like ban political speech outright, the way that knitting site Ravelry does. But if we agree to that, if we say, hey, this is the kind of community I want to be a part of, and agree to the rules, then I don't think that there's anything wrong with that.
Well, the platform that made the news yesterday, of course, is Clubhouse, because we had a brief window of Chinese users entering and using it as a platform for nuanced and free expression until it was banned. So,
Clubhouse is an interesting one. I did a little book reading there a couple weeks ago, and I've participated in a couple people's conversations, but I found it to be a really overwhelming platform so far. And, I joked about, it must have been 3 weeks ago when I joined, I joked that it was only like a week until the Nazis showed up, and I wasn't wrong.
It doesn't take long.
No, it does
Marilyn
not.
Monroe and Adolf Hitler always show up at the end of a conversation.
It's, what is it, Godwin's Law? Yeah.
Yeah. Godwin's law is how many steps before Adolf Hitler is introduced into the conversation. So I'm going to bring a next question.
On that note.
I know. On that note, let's move on to another question because we don't really want to, talk about it.
No, we don't. We've talked about Nazis enough this year.
No, exactly. Enough Nazi talk. So this question is from Arpan Rahman. Should we engage cyberspace being a possible place without defined regulation, even from their own rulers, and keep each other for security data between us by out of law outside the internet? I think I got that question. Is it possible to create an environment without regulation from nation states? What does it look like to imagine that, and for us to own our own data? And could we do that with the existing platform structure? Do we have to create something radically new for that to be true?
Yeah, okay, that is a really great question. I mean, I think, the early visionaries like John Perry Barlow saw cyberspace as a place outside of nation states. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, but you should definitely go read it or listen to a recorded version of it because it does talk a lot about this. And it got a lot wrong.
Yeah.
It's still a visionary idea, and I think it's really important to the formation of a lot of different paths of thinking. But yeah, I mean, I don't see cyberspace as possible existing outside of regulation anymore, at least not on a global scale. The second part of the question, is it? I mean, I do think that there's a role, even though. So I wrote a book chapter with Global Voices co-founder Ethan Zuckerman a couple of years ago that I'm still not sure. I don't think either of us are sure that we got it right, but where we were kind of critical of the kind of cropping up of blockchain-based decentralized social media platforms, and yet those are one of the only solutions that have been proposed so far, not just blockchain-based, but also the kind of the Fediverse, so to speak. And I'm not sure I can define that without looking it up right now. But I think those are some of the potential spaces that could exist outside of regulation, but they are also, there's a huge barrier to entry. And that's what Ethan and my criticism was mostly based on, the fact that you have to be able to build your own server. You have to have a much higher skill set than your average Facebook user does have. And so I don't see those as being a realistic alternative right now, especially at this moment where the next billion users are coming online and are going to be picking whatever's first in the browser. And often that's going to be Facebook or Google, because those are, the platforms that show up in Google search.
The other model that a lot of people are talking about for the past couple of years is something like a public service internet. We see that in the Netherlands. We see it in the UK. There's an effort out of the BBC to create kind of a BBC equivalent internet platform. I'm not quite sure what that would look like. And then there's also an interesting consortium in the Netherlands that's trying to build a kind of a consortium of nonprofits and civic-minded organizations that go from content to infrastructure, libraries, and so on and so forth. That, of course, isn't going to get us outside of regulation. That's a different model entirely. It's a civics model, but at least it would have defined rules. Are you seeing that in other places as well?
I mean, in fact, it's funny. I'd love to talk with you about that offline sometime, because EFF has been, and this idea came from Cindy Cohen, our executive director. We've been talking about the public interest internet, and we found ourselves sort of stuck in thinking beyond the usual suspects like Wikipedia, which is definitely a public interest platform. The Internet Archive, some of the sites that I think are like my favorite website. Whenever I get asked this question, is urbanrail.net. It's an old site that, and it is kind of a capitalist site. The guy has ads and he's selling books, but it has tracked subway and other transit lines over the world for decades now. And so, I mean, I think that there is this model of the public interest internet, but it's not funded in a consistent way, and it's not a consistent model. So I don't know as much about the sites you're talking about. I want to come back to that with you at some point. Mm-hmm. But there is this idea of sites that are in the public interest, and I do think that we should be furthering that concept immediately.
Yeah, I think when I think back on the past couple of years with Global Voices and how I think there was a shift in about 4 or 5 years ago, where I felt like we were starting to be, our basic message, which has not really shifted, which is that there should be a space for public open conversation driven by citizen voices and perspectives. And that it's actually not that complicated, though it often seems that way, because it doesn't have a central narrative. What it has is like a positive opening for people to kind of control or offer their own space, but to always make sure that it is in public.
Yeah.
And to the extent absolutely possible, driven by safety. And over, the now 15 or 16 years that we've been doing this, we've created basically a huge archive, almost like a historical record of public expression. But this idea has started to lose favor in the face of, funding interests around artificial intelligence or content moderation or misinformation projects or fact checking, all of these projects that are reactive to what's happening in the commercial space, reactive to what's happening in social media, rather than seeking to build and do something creative or positive that actually exists as a trustworthy space. And as much as I love Wikipedia, and I do love Wikipedia, there shouldn't just be one, right? There should be many. There should be many projects like this. And I'm wondering whether we're going to start to see a shift back to recognizing that some aspects of the maintenance of public information, this type of public information, are like good public health projects, which are like wash your hands, repeat for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah,
It's like the maintenance of a civic space is not necessarily the most exciting thing, but it is incredibly important. And it starts to make us ask us. My question then becomes: how do we turn something that began as a project or something that began as a kind of a creative initiative into something that has some aspects of an institution, whether as a funding or as or something else like that? So
this goes back to a question that you asked me a few minutes ago that I don't think I fully answered, which is like addressing problems in society at their root cause, rather than going, okay, speech is the problem and slapping a Band-Aid on it. And so, I like Global Voices, EFF, a lot of these groups are funded by funders who are constantly shifting their priorities based on kind of what they see as whatever humans see as the problem or governments are telling them is the problem. But they're still really reactive and reactionary, rather than going, okay, we need to look at this from a public health perspective or an educational perspective. It's really wild to me that we all just started washing our hands for 20 seconds last year. And I remember being at a conference, now I'm like airing dirty laundry, and it wasn't a Global Voices conference, but I was at a conference a couple years ago where like a huge group of people at the conference got norovirus, and it was because of a lack of hand washing. And then they added more soap to the bathrooms and put signs up, and the soap was gone within 2 hours. And it was just really wild to me that like it took putting that sign up. But I think that that's the thing, is that we need to start from first principles again with the internet. And like, as we log on to these sites, people are just thrown into them. They don't know what they're getting into. And then all of a sudden it's a speech problem rather than maybe a hate problem or an educational or, critical thinking problem. And so I'd like to see the funding models and the governments and foundations be looking at that, rather than constantly going, oh no, we have to fact check, instead of maybe we shouldn't have taught this information in schools from the beginning.
Yeah, so you're so right. The kill the messenger, the tendency to kill the messenger here is always really, really strong. It's like governments, instead of keeping their people safe or figuring out how to ensure that there is some kind of unified conversation, are simply seeking to censor or control. And I think, of all of the many strong messages in your book, I feel like that may be the strongest one, that we have to continually look at the underlying causes and figure out a path forward. We have a couple more questions, so let me try to bring some more voices in. This is from Philip. Do you think we will see more sovereign internets popping up in coming years?
Yes. I'm not sure from where. I definitely think we will. And I think, Iceland has done a lot of thinking around this. I forget what it used to be, the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative, IMI. I think it changed its name a little bit. But there's been a lot of thought coming from some great thinkers there. I think that we will see more micronations and states that want to kind of carve out an internet name for themselves coming up with these concepts. But I don't know how much of a solution they are to the problems that we have, right now. And, I think you can set up a server farm everywhere, but states change. And as long as we're in this current system, like you could have a government like Iceland, which is pretty progressive, put together a sovereign internet, and then you could have a fascist government come in and wipe it away. So again, I'm not sure how much of a long-term solution that is.
Could there be something like a sovereign internet, almost something like Estonia's kind of global citizenship approach, in which a country sets up its own sovereign internet with a set of kind of more a universalized set of norms that are really are civic minded, and then seeks to expand its sovereignty outside of its borders. Like, what would that look like? Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the U.S. did that, so maybe it's not the only one.
No, I mean, I think it's possible, but I think the reach that it would have is the question, right? So if that internet exists, let's say it exists in Estonia, it benefits Estonians greatly. It might benefit people who can VPN into Estonia, but is it going to benefit people in Turkey where the government is going to crack down on any of that access? Is it going to benefit people who can only get through their basic major ISP, which is restricting access to that internet? And so I think the question is who really benefits from it, and will it benefit people in more restrictive locations?
That's right. Maybe it solves one problem, but it certainly doesn't solve the larger problem, which is how people build and maintain their own rights in their own communities.
Yeah, it's not to say we shouldn't do it. I just think there is no panacea here.
Yeah, absolutely right. Okay, next question. Global South countries seem to be hit twice by American exceptionalism dynamics and a lack of knowledge of local contexts.
Yeah.
What can companies do to improve content moderation outside of the US and Europe?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's so frustrating. And I imagine so much more frustrating for the folks who are actually living in these countries. I experienced it when I lived in Morocco. That was where my first experience with internet censorship was, just from the government, not from the companies yet. But yeah, so to answer this, I mean, I think that there's a couple things that companies can do right this second to improve this dynamic. The first is hire locals. And that's not to say change your policies in every local context, but you need to have local people who can understand the language. You need to have more language coverage in the first place. It baffles me that when you look at, so first, Facebook's available in like some odd languages. You can get it in French, French, and Canadian French, but like, good luck if Luganda is the language you speak, because there's no one there who speaks it and you can't access it in that language. So that's something that they can do immediately, is like stop focusing on the West and start putting the money towards, just basic things like language understanding, nuanced content moderation that takes into account, the local meaning of a word rather than trying to slap a filter on it. And we've seen this happen in a number of places where, a word that has a double meaning, I'll use an English word just so that I'm clear on what I mean, but like the word dyke, which is often a slur toward lesbians, but can also be a thing that exists in a waterway, or a reclaimed word that lesbians use to refer to themselves. You slap a filter on that and all of it's gone, rather than just the negative uses of it. And so imagine that, but then imagine that in another language that the company has a lot less understanding of. And that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with right now. So yeah, put more locals on it, put more nuanced moderation on it, and stop using automation to try to solve these problems, because it's never going to work.
Global Voices has a project we've been running for the past almost 2 years now called the Civic Media Observatory, that does kind of deep dive analysis of subtextual and contextual language in an attempt to kind of explain all the nuances. And one of the things, after we've done about 10 or 12 projects in the last year and a half, and it takes a lot of work to even if you are knowledgeable and local and skilled in the local context, to unpack meaning. And I feel like even that approach is reacting to things rather than setting frames. And I mean, we have to figure out how to create policies that forestall a lot of the worst aspects of it. And of course, that's not easy.
No, it's not. I remember one of the posts from Global Voices that I cite in the book was one about, I'm not going to use the word because I know that it is a slur in addition to having a number of other meanings, but it was a Burmese word that can be used as a slur against the Rohingya, but can also mean split pea soup or something like that. And I was thinking like that's a perfect example of why you can't put automation on this problem, why you need a local to figure it out, but then also how, like, if you use that in kind of a double entendre meaning or something like that, then what is the content moderator even supposed to do? And then add on to that the fact that they're supposed to make that decision in like a half second, and you're faced with an impossible problem.
Yep, especially at anything approaching scale. It's completely impossible. We are coming up close to the hour, so I'm going to ask. Let's take one more question, and then this is from Misty Yang. Given the scale, speed, and concretization of the internet, how quickly speech can silo a community such as white supremacists? Do you think the same offline free speech standards can work online?
Yes and no. So I would like to see the same universalist ideals work online. And that is to say that we create a system that puts a universal set of rules in place, whether it's, for me, it would be Article 19. So there would be some limitations around certain types of violent speech, but again, there would still be pretty strict tests applied to what could be restricted. So I'm not an absolutist. I'm not really necessarily in agreement with the American idea of this, although I understand why the American idea is used often and is important, because again, these decisions about what is hate speech are really difficult to make. But then to get more into that question, I think that the standards for speech can work online, but we can't just have, I don't think a big just free for all works. I think that you have to think about things like algorithmic amplification. Again, like if we're incentivizing some of the worst speech to rise to the top, then we're not just talking about offline free speech standards, because that would be like, incentivizing people to go stand out in the square and yell the worst things, rather than saying, okay, like, we have the field over here, we've got the speaker's corner over here, etc. And to use a different example, I think when we think about offline propaganda, we wouldn't just let, like, I don't want to use Russia, but I'm going to. We wouldn't just let Russia like poster all over Washington, D.C. I don't think, we wouldn't say that that's free speech, because it would be a state coming in and putting all of these, like throwing propaganda everywhere. We would say, okay, this is like, we have rules against this for a reason. And those rules often aren't applied on the internet. And so I think that, right now it's not even the same free speech rules that are being used online. But I realize that's a complex question and a complex answer. But again, I think we have to look at these things piece by piece and look at what the monetary incentives are that exist online that don't exist offline.
So we have I'm going to actually break my own rule and use one last question as an opportunity to ask you to wrap up. So Juliana asks, do you still believe that universal values in the internet can work in the future? Since we're starting, we have like Silicon Valley, we have universal values, which are a stand-in for Silicon Valley in some ways. Where are we going, and what are you interested in? Where are you going to take us next with your work? After a long nap.
After a long nap, yeah. Do I still believe? I'm not sure. Do I want to believe? Yes, I do want to believe that. I'm still an optimist, and I still do think that, I'm an optimist, I'm an internationalist, and I guess I am kind of a universalist. I'm not a big fan of God, I can't even think of the term right now. What is the term I'm looking for, Ivan? Read my mind.
Particular list. Not exactly.
Sure. Cultural relativist. Yeah, there you go.
Relativist. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not big on that. So I would like to see a universal values exist. I'm not sure that it will or can, but I do think, again, like we should be thinking about a diversity of platforms. We should be thinking about ensuring accountability measures on the existing platforms that we have, and I think we can get close to that. But I also think that we have to take a step back from the internet and speech and look at this from a societal level, and we need to be fixing our societies from the ground up, rather than just slapping a Band-Aid on every problem that comes up as a speech problem online.
That's super. That's so good. No, it's so good. It's so right. Like the problem, the way to fix speech is not just about fixing speech. It's about fixing societies and fixing our governance and fixing everything, and because they're completely intertwined and interconnected.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Jillian. This has been fabulous. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, and I really enjoyed knowing so many of my old friends are there watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everybody is very excited to read your book when it comes out, March 23rd, as the date.
March 23rd.
So you can pre-order Silicon Values using the link on Global Voices homepage, or you can also find out more information about it on Jillian's personal site. And while you're on Global Voices, stick around, read our coverage of world events and topics, and consider signing up to our newsletter as well. Or follow us on Twitter and Facebook or any of the other social platforms that exist in the commercial world, which we all have to participate in, whether or not we want to in some way, because at the moment they are they are the ones setting the framework for international conversations. Oh, and we have one final question. Jillian, what else should we read? That's a great
So my blog, I still have a blog. It's got a great list of books that are coming out or just came out. But obviously the book to read right now is Ethan Zuckerman's book, which the title is blanking me right this second.
Mistrust.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So my top blog post right now lists about 6 or 7 books related to tech and some a little bit more related to society. I'm trying to pull it up right now that you should read. But yeah, start with Ethan's and then go on to Kate Crawford's new book, Kate Darling's new book, a collection called The Future Starts Now, another collection called Your Computer is on Fire, and The Disordered Cosmos. That's my list of reads right now. Oh, and the new book on Facebook coming out too in a few months.
Okay, super.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot. All right.
Sorry.
No, it's wonderful. More books is better.
Yes.
So once again, thank you so much, Jillian. Jillian C. York's new book, Silicon Values, longtime friend, family member of Global Voices, and I've read it. You should too. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.